She was merely providing refuge to a famished boy at her mountain cabin's entrance. Yet, 7 years down the line, when the preacher inquired if anyone opposed their marriage, the entire congregation would be left in shocked silence as Blesswind Ironwright declared her his spouse. What began as an act of compassion would evolve into the most contentious love story the region had ever known. The wind roared through the pine trees as Korinth Darian detected the urgent pounding at her cabin door. Through the icy window, she could scarcely discern the outline of a small, frail figure, huddled against the harsh cold. Her hand paused on the wooden latch. Having lived alone in these secluded mountains for 3 years since her husband's death, she had grown wary of strangers. But there was something in the feeble, steady knocking that tugged at her heart, acknowledging genuine distress. She swung open the heavy door and drew in a sharp breath. A boy no older than 17 stood unsteady on her porch. His clothes were in shreds, his face sunken from hunger. His lips were blue from the icy air. Snow clung to his dark hair, and his eyes held the vacant stare of someone who had wandered for days without sustenance or proper refuge. "Please, ma'am," he murmured, his voice almost inaudible over the wind. "I haven't had food in 4 days. I'll do any work for just a piece of bread." Korinth felt her maternal instinct surge, overriding her caution. Without a word, she stepped aside and motioned for him to enter the warmth of her cabin. The boy lurched inside, his legs barely able to hold him. She steadied him as he nearly fell, feeling how emaciated he was beneath his tattered coat. "Sit by the fire," she instructed softly, leading him to the wooden chair beside her stone hearth. "What's your name, son?" "Blesswind Ironwright, ma'am. I've been on the move since my parents succumbed to fever." I had nowhere else to turn. As Korinth prepared him some food, she observed how he gazed around her humble cabin, with awe rather than criticism. Most travelers who found themselves at her door seemed disappointed by her modest furnishings and isolated setting. But this boy's eyes held sincere gratitude, as if her small home was a sanctuary to him. She filled a bowl with hearty stew and watched as he ate with deliberate, controlled bites, despite his evident hunger. He had manners, she noted. Someone had raised him well before tragedy befell his family. "You can stay the night," she heard herself say. "The storm is worsening, and you're in no state to travel." Blesswind looked up from his bowl, tears mingling with the melted snow on his cheeks. "Thank you, ma'am. I swear I won't cause any trouble." But as Korinth watched him warm himself by her fire, she had no inkling that trouble was precisely what this act of kindness would invite. For what she believed was a temporary act of charity would soon transform into something the mountain community would struggle to accept. Blesswind stirred the following morning to discover Korinth already bustling about the cabin, preparing their meal. He had enjoyed a restful night's sleep, cocooned in warm blankets near the fading fire. However, as his mind cleared, so did his regret at imposing on this generous woman. "Ma'am, I believe it's time for me to leave," he announced, easing himself into a sitting position. "You've been more than kind to a stranger." Korinth faced him, her calloused hands cradling a plate piled with eggs and biscuits. "Not until you've recovered your vigor," she insisted. "Just look at you, boy. You're all skin and bones." Blesswind yearned to argue, but the scent of a hearty meal made his stomach rumble with urgency. As he ate, Korinth appraised him with the discerning gaze of someone accustomed to making pragmatic choices. She discerned promise in his slender build, wisdom in his deliberate conduct, and something more that stirred within her an unfamiliar resolve. You mentioned you'd work in exchange for sustenance, she remarked after a pause. I could use an extra hand with the spring planting. My husband used to handle the more demanding chores, and I've been managing alone since his passing. Blesswind's face brightened with hope. Yes, ma'am. I'm familiar with farming, and I'm handy with my hands. I can mend things, chop wood, care for animals, whatever you require. What Korinth hadn't anticipated was how effortlessly they would sync their efforts. Blesswind exceeded her expectations, demonstrating an aptitude beyond his years. He mended the leaning fence post, chopped enough firewood to endure the upcoming winter, and even persuaded her obstinate old mule to comply. In the evenings they would settle by the fire, Korinth mending clothes while Blesswind carved tiny wooden figures. Their dialogues flowed naturally, comfortably. He recounted tales of his family's farm, his aspirations of one day owning his own land. She reminisced about her late husband, recounting stories of the mountain's harsh winters and fleeting, beautiful summers. Months passed, and what had begun as a temporary arrangement evolved into something neither had foreseen. Blesswind no longer slept by the hearth, but had constructed a small shelter adjoining the cabin. Yet he continued to share his meals with Korinth, assist her with every task, and regard her with a gratitude that had gradually deepened into something more profound. The issue was that Blesswind was no longer the desperate, half-starved youth who had appeared at her doorstep. He was blossoming into a man before her eyes, his shoulders widening with nourishing food and labor, his voice deepening, his demeanor growing more assured, and Korinth found herself acknowledging these transformations in ways that both bewildered and unsettled her. One evening, as they watched the sunset bathe the mountains in gold and purple, Blesswind turned to her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Korinth, he murmured softly, addressing her by her first name for the first time. I've had something on my mind, and I must share it before my nerve fails. Korinth's heart pounded as she anticipated Blesswind's revelation. In the dimming light, his expression seemed more mature, more resolute than she had ever witnessed. The youth who had appeared at her doorstep was replaced by an individual whose unwavering gaze stirred emotions she had believed vanished with her husband's passing. I wish to remain, he declared. Not merely for the season or until I find another place. I desire to establish a life here with you. His words lingered between them like the fading smoke from the dying hearth. Korinth felt her breath hitch, torn between the warmth that filled her chest and the cold voice of reason that cautioned about decorum, about the whispers that would arise from the 28 years that lay between them. Blesswind, you are still so young. You should seek someone of your own age. Begin a family of your own. He shook his head, his jaw set with a determination that reminded her he was no longer the helpless boy she had taken in. I know what I want, Korinth. These months with you have been the most joyful of my life. You rescued me from more than just hunger. You provided me with a home, a purpose, a reason to greet each new day. Their discussion was abruptly halted by the sound of approaching horses. Through the trees they could see lanterns swaying in the darkness, and Korinth felt a sense of foreboding wash over her. Visitors to her secluded cabin were uncommon, and they never arrived after dark unless something was amiss. 3 men materialized from the shadows. Pastor Williamson from the Valley Settlement, accompanied by 2 of the town's most influential figures. Their expressions were severe in the lantern light. and Korinth instantly understood that their visit was not a friendly one. "Good evening, Mrs. Darian," Pastor Williamson greeted stiffly. "We need to discuss your current living situation." Blesswind moved closer to Korinth, his hand instinctively reaching for the axe handle, leaning against the porch railing. "Is there an issue here?" "You are the issue, son," said Caleb Quillcarver, the settlement's self-proclaimed moral guardian. "Rumors have spread about you residing here with a widow. People are talking, and it's not the kind of talk that benefits anyone." Korinth felt her cheeks flush with a mix of embarrassment and anger. "What Blesswind and I do on my own property is none of your concern or anyone else's. When it impacts the moral fabric of our community, it becomes our concern," Pastor Williamson retorted. "The boy needs to leave, find suitable accommodations with a family, or settle in town. This arrangement is improper, but as the men outlined their demands, neither Korinth nor Blesswind was prepared for the revelation about the settlement's true intentions, for someone had been observing them far longer than they had realized, and what they had seen would compel a choice that neither of them had anticipated. Pastor Williamson retrieved a folded sheet from his coat, holding it up to the lantern light. Korinth could make out the tidy script covering the page, and a chill ran down her spine as she guessed its contents. "It appears someone has been meticulously tracking your daily routines," the pastor announced, his voice heavy with concern. "They've noted the times the boy comes and goes from your cabin, any moments of close interaction, shared meals, private talks, and even instances of him working shirtless in your presence." Blesswind took a step forward, his face flushed with indignation. "Who's been watching us? If you have accusations, come forward and say them to our faces." Caleb Quillcarver shared a significant look with Aldrich Silverreed, who had been quiet until now. Silverreed cleared his throat before speaking. "It was my wife, Starcrest. She's been concerned about the potential moral impact this situation might have on our own children. She felt compelled to record her observations during her herb-gathering trips as part of her Christian duty." Kaylor felt a surge of anger and violation. Starcrest Silverreed's herb-gathering was clearly a guise for spying on them, turning innocent moments into something sinister. Every act of kindness, every shared laugh, every moment of genuine friendship had been warped into evidence of wrongdoing. "You want to know what Starcrest really witnessed?" Korinth's voice trembled with fury. "She saw a kind-hearted young man assisting an elderly widow in these harsh mountains. She saw dedication, hard work, and mutual respect. If your minds are so tainted that you see sin where there is only compassion, that reflects more on you than on us." But Pastor Williamson wasn't done. He fully unfolded the paper, revealing page after page of notes. "According to this record, the boy has been living here for 8 months. 8 months, Mrs. Darian. That's far beyond temporary assistance." Blesswind reached for Korinth's hand, a gesture that made all 3 men bristle with disapproval. "We've done nothing wrong. Korinth saved my life, and I've worked to repay her. If that poses a threat to your community, perhaps you should reevaluate the kind of community you're fostering." Aldrich Silverreed's expression grew stern. "Boy, you'd be wise to mind your words. We're trying to help you avoid a situation that could tarnish your reputation forever." "And if we decline your help?" Korinth asked, though she feared the response. The 3 men exchanged glances again, and Pastor Williamson carefully refolded the paper before tucking it back into his coat. "Then we'll have no choice but to escalate this matter to the territorial authorities. A formal complaint about moral decay could lead to legal repercussions neither of you would want to endure. As the men rode away into the night, Korinth and Blesswind stood in shocked silence. They had been presented with an ultimatum. Unbeknownst to them, Starcrest Silverreed had observed something else during her clandestine watchings. Kaelor harbored a secret she hadn't disclosed to the men, a revelation that could alter everything. 3 days elapsed in a tense quietude following the men's departure. Kaelor found herself startled by every rustle, wondering if Starcrest Silverreed was still skulking in the woods, pen and malevolent notions in hand. Blesswind labored with a somber resolve, but Kaelor could sense the fury brewing beneath his composed facade. On the fourth dawn, an unanticipated guest appeared. Starcrest Silverreed herself stood at their threshold, but instead of the self-righteous arrogance Kaelor anticipated, the woman's expression was ashen and distressed. "I must confer with you both," Starcrest murmured, "regarding what I concealed from my husband and the others." Kaelor's heart plummeted. What more could this woman have distorted into scandal? However, as Starcrest entered the cabin and sank into the proffered chair, her manner was far from the vengeful informant Kaelor had envisioned. "I've been observing you for months," Starcrest commenced, her voice barely audible. "Initially, yes, I was searching for misconduct. A young man and a widow cohabiting seemed amiss, but what I genuinely witnessed bewildered me." Blesswind and Kaelor exchanged bewildered looks as Starcrest proceeded. "I witnessed you tending to him through his fever last month when he fell ill from toiling in the rain. I saw you instructing him to improve his reading by lamplight. I saw him offering you his own blanket when yours was torn, sleeping chilled himself. I saw love, authentic love, not lust or impropriety, but the kind of profound devotion my own marriage has never known." Kaelor felt tears well up. "Then why did you inform on us?" Starcrest's hands fidgeted in her lap. "Because my husband anticipated I'd uncover something amiss. Because admitting I saw something beautiful would mean confronting what's lacking in my own life. Because sometimes it's easier to demolish what you can't possess than to face your own void." But Starcrest wasn't done with her confession. She retrieved another notebook from her bag, this one thicker than the first. "This contains what I truly saw. Every act of kindness, every moment of genuine affection, every evidence that what you share is precious and rare. I documented it because I yearned to remember that such love was possible." Blesswind leaned in, his attention rapt. "Why are you revealing this to us now?" "Because last night I overheard my husband and the others plotting. They're not merely going to report you to the territorial authorities. They're returning tomorrow with more men, intent on separating you forever." The gravity of her words hung heavy over them like a pall. "Aldrich believes that if they can declare you mentally unfit, Kaelor, they can have you confined to the territorial asylum. They are convinced that any woman who would live with a younger man must be afflicted with female hysteria." Kaelor's blood ran cold. She had been told of women who vanished into those places, never to resurface. "And Blesswind," Starcrest added, "they intend to have you arrested for exploiting a defenseless widow. Kylam Quillcarver has already discussed the matter with the sheriff." As Starcrest was about to depart, she paused and delivered one last shocking statement. "There's more you should be aware of," Starcrest murmured, her voice barely audible. "The true motive behind their desire to separate you has nothing to do with ethics." Korinth felt a wave of apprehension wash over her. What do you mean? Your deceased husband filed a mining claim on this property before his passing. Calum Quillcarver discovered the documents in the territorial office last month. There's silver hidden within these mountains, Corwin. Quite possibly a substantial amount. The news struck her like a punch to the gut. Corwin slumped into her chair, suddenly understanding the pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed. Her husband had mentioned examining some rocks near the stream, but she had dismissed it as mere curiosity. If they can have you deemed mentally incompetent, Starcrest went on, the land would likely be sold to cover the costs of your institutional care. Calum has already arranged to buy it at a fraction of its true worth. Blesswind's hands curled into tight fists. So this entire moral campaign is about seizing her land. That's precisely what it is. And if you're behind bars for exploitation, you can't defend her or challenge the sale. After Starcrest exited, vowing to stall the men for as long as possible, Korinth and Blesswind sat in shocked silence by the hearth. Everything they believed about their circumstances had been upended. They weren't confronting moral condemnation, but rather a scheme of greed masquerading as virtue. "We must leave," Blesswind declared after a moment. "If we're gone by tonight, they can't enforce anything." But Korinth shook her head resolutely. "This is my home. My husband is buried on this land. I won't be chased away by thieves and frauds." "Then what is your plan?" "Fight them off with an axe and a hunting rifle." Korinth approached the window, gazing out at the mountains that had been her sanctuary for 3 years. In the distance, she could see lights from the settlement, where men were likely plotting her downfall at that very moment. "There's one thing they can't take from us," she said thoughtfully, an idea taking shape in her mind. One thing that would render their accusations baseless and their legal maneuvers futile. Blesswind stood beside her at the window. And what might that be? Marriage. If we are legally married, they can't accuse you of taking advantage of me. They can't declare me mentally unfit for making a sensible decision. And as my spouse, you'd have the legal right to safeguard the land. The word lingered between them, laden with implications neither had fully contemplated until that instant. Blesswind examined her silhouette in the moonlight, looking for any trace of uncertainty or fear. "Is this a marriage proposal, Korinth Darian?" She pivoted to confront him, and in her gaze he detected resolve intertwined with an emotion that quickened his pulse. "I'm offering a way to secure our survival," Korinth replied. Yet her tone held a tenderness that belied her pragmatic words. "Though I won't deny that other emotions are at play." Blesswind grasped her hands, his youthful features grave in the flickering firelight. "I've harbored feelings for you for months, Kaler, or not as a boy indebted to kindness, but as a man who has found his purpose, if you'll accept me, despite the age gap and potential scandal." She gazed into his eyes and saw not the desperate, hungry youth who had once sought refuge at her door, but a steadfast, capable man who had chosen her, just as she had chosen him. "Then we proceed tonight, before they can intervene." However, locating someone to officiate the ceremony on such short notice seemed improbable, until Blesswind recalled a remark made by Starcrest. "There's an old trapper, Gareth Gryphonson, who resides near Eagle Ridge. He's a retired preacher, correct? If he's still living and willing to venture out in the night," Korinth stated, "it's our sole opportunity." They dedicated the following hour to preparations. Korinth retrieved her finest dress, a deep blue gown adorned with tiny pearl buttons, while Blesswind did his best to clean up using cold water and harsh soap. By the glow of the lantern, they appeared as they were, two individuals on the brink of the most pivotal decision of their lives, under the most adverse conditions. The journey to Gareth Gryphonson's cabin led them through perilous mountain trails in utter darkness. On multiple occasions, their horses faltered over loose stones or concealed roots. But upon arriving at the elderly trapper's door, they discovered him not only alive, but remarkably lucid, for someone well beyond 70. "Marriage, you say?" Gareth squinted at them through thick lenses. "At this hour, there must be a compelling reason driving you both." "There is," Korinth affirmed simply. "There are those who seek to tear us apart for their own benefit. This union is our sole defense." Gareth scrutinized them both with the discerning eye of someone who had witnessed every manner of human desperation in his lengthy life. "Well, I've witnessed stranger things in these mountains. And if two people wish to enter into a legal bond, I reckon that's their prerogative." The ceremony was concise yet sincere. By lamplight in Gareth's modest cabin, with only a hunting dog as a witness, Korinth Darian and Blesswind Ironwright exchanged vows that united them as husband and wife, in the eyes of both God and territorial law. "You may kiss your bride," Gareth declared with a kindly smile. As Blesswind's lips met hers, Kaelor felt a warmth she had not experienced since her first husband's passing. This wasn't born of desperation or strategic defense. This was genuine love, nurtured through months of shared trials and authentic companionship. As they readied themselves to depart as newlyweds, Gareth presented them with an official marriage document and uttered words that sent a shiver down their spines. "You should hasten back to your residence. I spotted riders approaching your direction roughly an hour ago." They seemed to be in quite a rush, and they were armed with more than just lanterns. Korinth and Blesswind urged their horses through the night, the marriage certificate tucked safely in Blesswind's jacket. Upon nearing their cabin, they witnessed precisely what Gareth had forewarned them about. 6 mounted men encircled their home, torches flickering and casting eerie shadows on the surrounding trees. Calum Quillcarver's voice echoed through the clearing. "Mrs. Darian, we are aware of your presence. Step out and confront the inevitable." However, when Korinth and Blesswind emerged from the tree line astride their horses, the men were taken aback, wheeling around in surprise. Calum Quillcarver's confident demeanor wavered as he grasped that his meticulously planned trap had backfired. "Gentlemen," Korinth addressed them, her voice steady despite her pounding heart, "allow me to introduce my husband, Blesswind Ironwright." The revelation struck the group like a bolt of lightning. Pastor Williamson urged his horse forward, his face contorted with disbelief. "That's preposterous. No clergyman in these parts would officiate such a union." Blesswind retrieved the marriage certificate from his jacket, the territorial seal plainly visible in the torchlight. "Gareth Gryphonson might contest that. The marriage is legitimate and duly recorded." Calum Quillcarver's facade of righteousness crumbled entirely. "You can't do this. That land is communal property. You have no right to," Korinth interjected, "to wed whom I please and retain my own land. Or are you finally willing to acknowledge that this was never about ethics?" Aldrich Silverreed fidgeted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Calum, perhaps we should reassess if they are indeed lawfully married." "Silence, Aldrich," Quillcarver snapped, then turned back to Korinth, his hatred unmasked. "You believe a mere document alters anything?" "I'll find another means to claim what is rightfully mine." But Blesswind advanced, no longer the timid youth who had first approached Korinth's door. "That sounds like a menace, Quill Carver, and threatening my wife on our own property could pique the territorial marshal's interest when I report your attempted theft." The other men began exchanging uneasy glances, clearly recognizing they had been duped into Quill Carver's plot. One by one, they turned their horses away from the standoff, leaving Quill Carver increasingly alone. Pastor Williamson was the last to depart. "Mrs. Ironwright," he stated stiffly, "I trust you understand the gravity of your actions." "I am fully aware of what I have done," Korinth affirmed. "I prioritized love over fear and joy over others' opinions." As the men vanished into the night, Korinth and Blesswind stood united before their cabin, genuinely as husband and wife for the very first time. The boy who had arrived hungry and desperate had transformed into a man capable of safeguarding their shared dreams. 5 years later, when the silver mine brought them wealth beyond their wildest dreams, visitors to the Ironwright homestead frequently remarked on the evident bond between the couple. Korinth had found love when she believed her life had reached its end, and Blesswind had learned that sometimes the most precious treasures aren't buried in the earth, but reside in the hearts of those who dare to forge their own journey. If this story touched you, give it a like and tell us in the comments. What would you have done if you were in their shoes? Subscribe to Frontier Stories and join us as we continue to tell stories of hope, resilience, and the beautiful, messy truth of Wild West.